I want to make sure that everybody is on the line. It looks like we have a significant amount of the commission present, and grateful for everyone joining us here today. First of all, as we get started this morning, I want to make sure that everyone knows this is a public meeting, that the press are on the call, and that council members and the city attorney are on the call. So just wanted to make sure all the commissioners knew that this meeting is dedicated to brief the commission and have questions and conversation with the commissioners about progress yet to date and plans for specific action steps moving forward on the recommendations from themselves that they submitted to me in January. So I want to thank Commission Chair Janet Jackson, all of the commissioners who put in so much time and effort into this work, and Police Chief Tom Quinlan. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. In January, we received your recommendations as a Safety Advisory Commission. I again want to thank you for your dedication and determination in this process. I want to ensure you that the recommendations you made are being implemented. Many are already completed, and great progress has been made on nearly every recommendation. What's more, your work set a strong foundation and informs the work we do every day. In this year's State of the City address, we called out racism that exists in every corner of our community. Black people and communities of color are angry, frustrated, tired, even fearful about many things happening around the country and right here in our city. As your mayor, it's my job to lead us to solutions. Racism is real. Discrimination is real. I shared my plans to confront racism where it exists and my plans to address it. Since then, we've declared racism a public health crisis and set bold goals to improve health outcomes and create more opportunities for communities of color. We've continued this work and began implementing your recommendations, even in the midst of a global pandemic, which until the tragic, senseless death of George Floyd consumed much of our collective time and energy. Now there's no greater priority than combating racism in every corner of our community, including within the Division of Police, and stopping police violence against people of color in Columbus. It is long past time. More than 2/3 of the Commission's recommendations have been implemented or in the process of being implemented. Chief Quinlan is making substantial progress with all of the remaining except for 6. These 6 fall outside of Chief Quinlan's purview. We're looking at other ways to address them. In a few moments, Chief Quinlan will go through each of the recommendations. But before he begins, I want to highlight what I know are top of mind for all of us. First is the establishment of an independent civilian review board. Per your recommendation, we will establish a group by July 1st that will create a civilian review board that works for Columbus. We will have a model by July 1st. Seat the board by the end of the year. Each of the commissioners with us today understand the complexity of establishing meaningful civilian oversight of the police. And much of what the community expects and demands may require concessions from the FOP. But the collective bargaining contract is up at the end of the year. And we are preparing to head to the table right now. And this and other reforms you have recommended and the public has demanded will be my top priority. Second, we will request a third-party investigation into all incidents of fatal use of force and other use of force complaints and violations of division policy that demand independent review. The city can't do this alone, but I am engaging the state and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to work to make this happen. Finally, this was not a Safety Commission recommendation, but one that came from the Matrix report. We are reevaluating the use of force continuum, including the use of spray agents to disperse crowds. These changes alone will not bring an end to racism, nor will implementation of all the Commission's recommendations. But for every change we make, there will be a call for more. But if we start with what we know is true and right, and we continue the hard work to implement the Commission's recommendations, we will make our community a safer place to live for all of our residents. Again, I want to say to this Commission and to all others who are listening, Columbus is taking action now, right now, fight racism and reform how we police. Now, I would like to invite our great chair of the Safety Commission, former judge, city attorney, and CEO and president of the United Way of Central Ohio, Janet Jackson. Janet?
Good morning, and I truly regret the fact that technology has failed me this morning and I've not been able to connect through WebEx. But I'm really happy to be here today to learn about the progress being made by the Columbus Division of Police. So I want to thank Mayor Ginther and Chief Quinlan for taking the time to update.
Janet, are you with us? Are you on mute?
No. You guys have to unmute me there. I didn't do it here.
I can hear her.
We can hear her.
We can hear her.
Here, I can hear you.
I can hear her.
So do you want me to continue?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay. So the mayor, referenced the fact that he received the report in January from the commission. And as we all know, we had 80 recommendations. Many of our recommendations encourage recruitment and hiring strategies essential for increasing diversity among our police officers, including civilian liaisons within New American and minority communities. We also call for reviewing testing materials for cultural relevancy and implicit bias, and we suggested giving favorable consideration for those who are fluent in additional languages. We made recommendations for mentoring opportunities during the first 3 years of service, especially for women, minorities, and those in the LGBTQ community. We incorporated numerous recommendations for community engagement because building community police relations is critical. It's critical to the future success of policing in Columbus. And now, more relevant than ever, we strongly recommended establishing a civilian review board to participate in the investigation of use of force by officers and complaints about serious Columbus Division of Police officer misconduct. These recommendations will build trust that has eroded in the minority community. These recommendations are wide-ranging, but they reflect great depth of thought and a sincere desire to provide guidance on how to best address some of the greatest challenges facing the division in our community today. Many challenges lie ahead, and again, especially now, and we have a lot of work to do. I remain encouraged and inspired by your commitment to advance change. So I want to say thank you, and I'm not sure if the mayor can hear me now or not. I believe that Chief Quinlan is up next, but maybe it goes back to the mayor.
Janet, Chair Jackson, this is Andy. I apologize for that. I had my sound turned down, so I didn't hear you initially, so I apologize if I talked over you, but thank you for your comments and your leadership. And yes, now we will go to Chief Quinlan. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning, Mayor, Chair Jackson, and commissioners and all participants viewing today. I'm pleased to be here to provide you with an update, give you some information on where we're at. I present, I think, best when I'm in person and able to walk around and talk with you and connect with you in person. And I prefer not to be in high definition, so I will do the best I can here on the technology side of this. So when we got the report from the commission, it was the end of January, and we had received the matrix report in late August. So we had made significant progress on the matrix report at that point. When the commission report came out, I got to work right away. Matter of fact, truth be told, I was working well before the report came out to incorporate change and make that a cultural change in our department, that we're actually focused on doing things new, doing things more progressive, and connecting better with the community. So with that in mind, when the 80 recommendations came out, we got started right away. Now on into January, on February 7th, I was officially took the oath as chief. And as we all know, by March 14th, Columbus was deeply entrenched in the COVID crisis. But I want to assure all the commissioners that while we work 7 days a week and focusing on COVID and keeping our community safe, your executive staff team of the Columbus Police did not allow that to be a single issue. We stayed focused on making change. And as evidenced by that, while all this was going on, I also scheduled and prepared a executive staff retreat on May 6th, 7th, 8th, and 11th. And it was well prepared and thought out. I have an entire document and an agenda that we prepared on that. After those 4 days of that meeting, I presented to all the commanders and told them where change is going to occur and where we're at. So I'm pleased to report actually that at this point, after all this going on throughout our community, we have still been successful in completing 14 of the 80 recommendations, and another 35 of the 80 are substantially in progress, nearing completion. So 61% of your recommendations have been implemented and in the process of being fully realized. And I want to make sure that I'm very clear on how important this was. The agenda, you can't see it here, but the agenda that I have, just to show you that there was an agenda. Day one, hour one, and then full first day was dedicated to nothing but line by line, recommendation by recommendation, the matrix report and the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission recommendations. So we tackled those first and made sure that we were on the right path to get those done. So the recommendations on recruitment, we have made substantial progress on that, and we are seeing the diversity of our classes grow, and we're also seeing the diversity through the ranks begin to change. The training academy has included specific training in crowd control tactics, which was part of the matrix recommendation, and I ordered change to the policy on there, and that was implemented in December of 2019 under the matrix. The training academy has integrated language services, working to make sure we are more responsive to those who need that assistance. We have made a process, thanks to the director's office, of bringing in a specialist to handle the EO violations that are reported and have those investigated by an outside person, outside the chain of command, outside the Division of Police, but within the Department of Public Safety. And our officers continue to have and have always had the ability to seek redress with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission and state EO and other resources through civil process. And we've also, part of the change I made was create a community services subdivision. A lot of what we've done in the past is really kind of focused on internally how we divide officers up across the Division of Police to provide service. But we've never truly had a community services subdivision or where we're really lacking is in youth services. So I've created both community services subdivision and youth services, and those are now in place and staffed, and we are working on how we more fully develop youth services. The idea at first was to be in rec centers and places where teens hang out and boys and girls clubs. With COVID, with the idea that a lot of those establishments are not available to people right now, we are changing midstream to make sure we still find a way to connect with teens where they are and provide services and positive interactions. In progress, again, is a better pipeline for recruitment for our cadets, for individuals interested in becoming police officers, and how we recruit and use the Explorer program. We've changed the public safety cadet program, and we're working with Columbus City Schools to make a pipeline from school to work opportunities in those 18 to 21 year phase, and then apply to the Division of Police. We've improved and expanding our cultural competency training and improved scenarios for our assessors who grade applicants who are applying for the Division of Police. And I've worked with the Anti-Defamation League to bring in training that is prepared by them and a fairly accepted program that is consistent with the 6 pillars of 21st century policing to provide every officer under the Division of Police specific training on implicit bias and cultural competency. I've modified our juvenile justice training programs and de-escalation training programs for youth, and we're in the process of developing programs to specifically train officers in how to engage youth, because the teen brain is not fully mature and is different than a mature adult. And if we don't recognize that people may react and respond to interactions differently, then we are not doing our part to make sure we can have a safer and better understanding in those interactions that we are naturally going to have. And another recommendation we're working on is community service where officers serve. And we're looking for a lot of different opportunities there, but we've also started, we have basketball camps. We have the lacrosse coaching that we're doing with inner city youth. We're building with the Police Foundation, the Mobile Clue Center for Learning, Understanding, and Education, continuing TAPS programs. I'm looking to take the TAPS program, the Teen and Police Service Academy, into the Juvenile Detention Center and work with teens there to start building those relationships with maybe some of our most at-risk teens. So those are all in progress, as well as our continuing crisis intervention training, and to include dispatchers. The first contact someone has with police is typically a communications technician, and they may be able to pick up on concerns that would maybe otherwise be missed, that they may not be able to convey to officers responding, and make sure that they're sending CIT trained officers or the mobile crisis responders to those scenes. So they're going to be more receptive and more perceptive to pick up on when there's maybe need. Plus, they may be able to start some de-escalation right there on the phone and help provide people some peace of mind while they're waiting for the police to arrive. A critical area that we are working in progress, and I have made a top priority, is to update our technology. In updating our computer-aided dispatching and records management system, it's a suite of software products that's cloud-based, and that suite would include an early intervention system for officers. So you've heard talk about our EARS program, and we do an employee action review, but it's really limited to uses of force and citizen complaints. Those are not always telltale signs of when an officer may be having difficulties adapting and coping with the stresses of what police work is, the realities of police work. And so we're working on creating dashboards through this software suite that would allow us to more readily pick up on incidents where people might need an intervention. So those are our priorities. We're implementing annual surveys. We've always done community surveys. We're refining that and perfecting it for the community. We're also doing the same thing now, preparing one for internal to make sure we understand where maybe we're not communicating enough with officers, where we're not providing enough resources and services for officers, so they can come to work prepared and make sure they're doing the job to the best of their capacity. And I think by creating some of these programs that we'll see a better joint response, because we can respond to what the citizens are telling us their expectations are, and we can adapt also with what officers' needs are, so we make sure we don't miss something that should be captured earlier and acted on. And we're also continuing, there'll be a process in place to continue the good work of the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission, and we are working on ways of making that happen. So in general, what I hope you see is, despite COVID and the crisis that we're dealing with, a nationwide pandemic, despite the fact we're dealing with a nationwide crisis with racism and with riots in every major city in the United States right now, the recommendations, the time you spent, the 22 months you spent looking A to Z at the Division of Police and helping us set expectations of the community for us, that we have never taken our foot off the gas and making change. Change will continue. In addition to the 80 recommendations, the commission and 139 recommendations of Matrix, I started my retreat with my executive staff members with a theme. The theme is relational policing. And I followed that up with, we need to innovate or become irrelevant. And I opened with a quote from Einstein. And the quote was, we cannot solve our problems using the same thinking we did when we created them. And so I challenged my entire staff to make sure that they were prepared to implement change, and that was very a critical function of this. And in addition to what the advisory commission has asked for, just again, you won't be able to necessarily see this, but I just want to be able to kind of hold it out. There's about 6 pages there of to-do, 2020 and 2021 to-do list, an 18-month plan that I have prioritized by 1, 2, or 3. I have set down as whether it's compliant or fulfills the recommendation of Matrix or the Mayor's Commission, or if it's just something I want to do that I'm directing change. And I put who it's assigned to. There's an owner to every one of these. Now, not every one of these are going to be, once we vet them and discuss them, are going to be implemented. We're going to talk about the practicality of them. These are all just right now brainstorming and ideas that this is change. What can we implement? What can we do now? And how can we get there? So of about 140 recommendations there is no shortage between 139 with the Matrix, 80 with yours that we've completed 61% or on our path to, and 140 of my own. I hope you trust that we've taken this task seriously. We have implemented change, and there is more change to come. And I respect and value the time that you put into this and the advice and consultation you've provided to make our police service more responsive to the community and allow us to be better stewards of the community trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. I want to give Chair Jackson an opportunity to ask any questions she may have, and then open it up to the rest of the commission. I do want to make sure I'm being clear, and I accept responsibility if I was unclear when I stated this earlier, that we, Council President and I, will establish a work group by July 1st that will help create a civilian review board that works for the city, and we will seat that board by the end of the year. Obviously, it will take negotiations, but I want to make sure that folks understand that that group that will be seated by July 1st will come up with a model that works for Columbus. The Council President and I will work together on getting that group seated, and that we will have an independent civilian review board seated by the end of the year. with making this our top priority in negotiations with the FOP and trying to, I'll be honest with you, I know he and I have been having conversations in the community because people want to know what they can do and how they can be involved, particularly around this issue. And we're asking people to organize and to make their voices heard and attempting to build a coalition that isn't just government leaders, that isn't just activists, but the business community, the establishment, having not just communities of color calling for this, but the majority community as well, and speaking with one voice about this being our community's top priority. Whether you're a CEO or an activist or an elected official, this is our community's top priority for this year. So with that, I will shut up and let commissioners speak. I just, we obviously have lots of commissioners. My guess is there are probably lots of questions and so forth. I'll let Chair Jackson ask any questions and then open it up to the group. And if we can just make sure that we're not talking over each other. And feel free to direct questions to the chief, myself, Chair Jackson, and we'll go from there. Chair Jackson, do you have any questions, or should we open it up to the group?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I do. Chief, in light of the recent events across the country, the world, and in Columbus, and watching and seeing members of our police force using pepper spray and other forms of crowd containment, I found many of the images to be very, very, very challenging. Is it your belief that the policies that we currently have were being utilized over the last several days? And if not, what are we doing about it?
Thank you very much, Chair Jackson. First of all, two quick things. I've neglected to inform you that I also have Commander Bob Meter here, which everyone's familiar with from attending all the commission meetings, and also that with tragic loss of life of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and our hearts go out to any loss of life and to this situation, especially. I am a member of Major City Chiefs, and I signed on with Major City Chiefs condemning the actions of the officers and believe that they took the right steps to terminate and to criminally charge those officers. This is both the matrix and the commission report. I keep this on my desk at all times. And regarding the question about the use of chemical agents, again, what I would like to point out that after doing this job for 30 plus years and not only being involved in hundreds and hundreds of encounters, but also planning and operating, leading responses as an incident commander. And also we have a part of the Attorney General lesson plan here on crowd control and its civil disorder. Just to point out that in here, and we have multiple years, this is 2016, 2019, they use subject matter experts to write the lesson plan. And if you'll see on here, I was asked by the Attorney General to serve as the subject matter expert to write the lesson plan for the state. And these also meet CLIA requirements. Also, our policy has been reviewed by the city attorney's office and approved. So our policy before the matrix report came in simply said that sworn personnel may use their division issue chemical spray to disperse a nonviolent congregation of violators who are not moving after, when possible, 2 notices are provided. I have changed that language in response to the matrix to say, if exigent circumstances exist, such as individuals creating a risk of safety or a hazard, sworn personnel may use their division-issued chemical spray to disperse nonviolent congregation of individuals who are not complying with lawful commands, and 3, notifications should be issued. Now we're seeing, in reality, we're issuing 40, 50. In one case on video yesterday, I watched, we issued 105 orders. So there's an issue with nonviolent crowds when we talk about using chemical agents in nonviolent crowds. One, there are people intermixed in a crowd that who may be escalating to violence, that chemical agents don't pinpoint or target individual perpetrators. They contaminate an area. And the second thing, the reason it made it for exigent circumstances is the idea, and again, this has to come through 30 years of experience and training, and I've trained every officer in the division for years on this, is learning what the flashpoint is. When you have a nonviolent group of protesters, crowd mentality, mob mentality can take over, and good people who mean no harm can get caught up in the moment, and a flashpoint can happen, and it can suddenly erupt into violence. Using control tactics to spread that crowd out and bring the temperature down of that crowd so people that are instigators are not able to create that crowd into a flashpoint. So those are very important. And I won't specifically dissect issues with this current riot, but let me just speak briefly how that would apply. We'll go back to the campus protests and riots of 2016 after the national championship game. People were on the sidewalk, and then they would run out into the street and jump on fire trucks driving down the street who were responding to fires in dumpsters that were being set that were burning so high they were burning power lines down that were overhead and breaking power lines that were going to people's house where people lived, and right beside houses that could have caught them on fire and people could have died. So even though they were nonviolent, they were running into the street, getting on fire trucks, riding down the street as they were running lights and siren, and then would run back to the sidewalk. So sometimes because that flashpoint's there, it is appropriate to use a chemical agent to disperse that crowd to make sure we bring the whole temperature down and get people back to the lawful protesting, not the illegal, non-compliant protesting by ignoring orders. So I hope that maybe gives some context.
The only thing I would add, Chief, to your question, Chair Jackson, it was clear to me that regardless of what our policy was, what I saw and what I heard and what was shared from me from peaceful protesters last Saturday, that our police's response did not meet my or the community's expectations for pepper spray and other chemical agents to be used on peaceful protesters as early as 10 a.m. Last Saturday in the way that was done was unacceptable. And so I called the chief and I told him that, and he received it, and I think there's been a significant change in the way that peaceful protesters have been engaged since then. But I don't think our policy at this point, and this is what I spoke to earlier, our policies have had the community input in review around use of force, continuum, use of spray agents, those types of things. I think they're still based on minimum legal standards and maybe some other things that law enforcement agencies have recommended and put in place, but they don't reflect the community's expectations. And that is what the Chief's Advisory Council is going to do. And these issues, these policies have to be our top priority, so that we change those things immediately. Chair Jackson, I'll turn it back to you.
No, thank you, Mayor. I'm finished.
Okay, I see Commissioner Wilkinson has a question. I'd like to recognize Commissioner Wilkinson.
Thank you, Chief. Just a couple things. I live in the short north, and was at ground zero for some of all that took place over the weekend. And they were very peaceful protests, but the National Guard and the Columbus Police Division of Police in riot gear was very heavy-handed in terms of flashbangs and language and everything else. And many of the, and I can tell you, I mean, I lived just a few steps from where all that took place, and can hear all the loudspeakers and the rumblings of the vehicles, and all the other things going on. And I can guarantee you that at that point in time, well before curfew, that everything was extremely peaceful. And I just didn't understand, knowing this business, why that we had to have such a heavy-handed approach to those persons who were very, very peacefully protesting, and were being directed to send folks home. So let me get my other issue out, and then I don't have any other questions at this point in time. One of the, I think it's very noble for us to have, and for the Division of Police to have, diverse recruit classes and so forth. But I think, an equally important challenge, I think, is to have diversity throughout the entire ranks of the Columbus Division of Police, including middle management, including senior leadership. From the last report that I've seen, and we haven't met for a while, so I haven't seen anything recent. The senior leadership, the chief's cabinet is not very diverse in terms, if unless I've seen something different, unless something different has happened over the course of the last 6 months. So I think the approach should be not just recruit classes, but having a diverse command system throughout middle management, throughout senior leadership, and to reflect that throughout the entire ranks of the Columbus Division of Police, that it's representing the community of the city of Columbus.
Well, thank you, sir. As a commissioner, our first question was about the tactics used in the short north area specifically, and others. We've spent a lot of time going through a lot of video, and again, I don't have all the answers, and that's why the mayor's already announced that, City Attorney Zach Klein announced that there would be a independent investigation review of all activities and actions taken once we restore a continuous safety for the city. So that'll be, those answers will certainly be evaluated and dissected. I can say from what I do have knowledge of, and I can't speak for everything that's occurred, but what I have knowledge of is, while there were certainly absolutely very compliant and passive protesters speaking their voice and had good and tough criticism that we needed to hear, there were other people that I can tell you from what I've witnessed on the ground level and on video that were throwing frozen water bottles, chunks of concrete, and other stuff. And we've had 166 police officers as of yesterday. I don't have today's numbers. 166 police officers injured, several that have gone to the hospital for treatment. So when we have that many officers, and that's even with the gear that they were wearing. And so again, that's to protect officers. I have a duty to protect the public, and I also have a duty to protect the officers and try to provide as much, although it's a dangerous job, provide as much of a safety as I can for them, so they, by setting policy and practices and tactics that allow them to maintain some semblance of safety. On the second issue on diversity, one thing is, since my promotion, we have been fortunate enough to promote Commander Jennifer Knight to Deputy Chief, and that has provided the first opportunity we've had for diversity at executive staff level since Chief Jacobs retired. And we also, with her promotion, that also led to the promotion of Commander Rock Ally, which is a male black officer who is now the commander of Zone 2, East Side Patrol. So we've taken two important steps, but we also recognize the value of diversity through the ranks. And I mentioned that earlier in my comments, that not only are we recruiting a diversity pipeline, but we are working on plans to improve diversity through the ranks and mentorship programs and ways that we can provide more voices to be heard within the division that bring their life experience and their knowledge and competencies with them so we can improve our overall decision making. Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add is that it is part of the chief's, my annual review of the chief in partnership with the director is owning the diversity throughout the ranks of leadership positions. So it isn't just important amongst deputy chiefs and commanders, but at the lieutenant and sergeant level, because as you all know, the lieutenants and sergeants of today become the commanders and the deputy chiefs of tomorrow. And so charging the chief and holding him accountable for making sure that he is doing this, not just with our work overall of diversifying our classes, but what does each level of leadership look like in our community is something that we're holding him accountable for as well. But thank you for the question, and open it up to the next one.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple questions for the chief, but I would like to respond to the last question in regard to use of force. So I was there, as well as, and I know many people have seen the video of last Saturday. I was there. And so, Chief, as you spoke to notifying people, my first question in regard how, because I notified a sergeant in that moment while we were there to explain to him that we were peaceful, and everybody in this city knows my organization's history, that we were there and we were coming in peace. It took me forever, and I asked several frontline officers at the front line with those bicycles for a sergeant. They had no regard for my voice. Finally, I saw the sergeant who I recognized, and he did acknowledge me, and we did speak, and there is a video of that. And I guaranteed him that we were there in peace. So, use of force, how are you notifying? Because I spoke directly, and I'm not going to go too long because I know we don't have a lot of time. My second question in regard to your use of force is your bicycles, your horses, and all those things are a weapon. And we discussed this in the commission. And so I don't know if we are keeping data, but we beat people with those horses on Saturday. I was gassed, I was beat. My daughter called me screaming because she watched me get hit in the head with a horse on YouTube. And so I don't know how you're tracking how many people were abused on those streets, but I would like to know that. My other question in regard to what are in those chemicals, because the amount of chemicals that have been released in our city because of this excessive use of force is unacceptable. I am still cleaning chemicals off of all of my belongings. And so I'm going to leave that there. You have spoken to trust and legitimacy, which is the foundation of the 21st century report. And I know we don't have time, but I will get my questions to you, Chief. Trust and legitimacy starts with not just from policing, but establishing trust with truth. And so I know this is hard for our city, but we must tell the truth if we're going to solve this problem and restore trust with the community that has been in the streets for almost 7 days. I have the other last thing is trauma. So I heard nothing about trauma in anything that was mentioned. The effects of trauma on the brain when you've experienced this much violence for 7 days, and not just the protesters, but this entire city.
Okay, the mayor has been very clear. Thank you for the questions. Mayor's been very clear that there is a system in place to report misconduct that's perceived or alleged against officers, and that it will be investigated, and it can be done outside, within the division or outside the division through a process that he's set up. So I encourage you to please participate in that process so we can get to the bottom of those incidents that happen at the street level. Again, we are on both sides. We're dealing with imperfect people in imperfect circumstances, and I will not even pretend to think that mistakes can't be made or that improvements are not needed. So we are eager to hear where we did fall short and where we can make improvements on that. So please participate in that process. And is there any other?
What was in it?
The chemicals, it's excuse me, I lost my voice. The chemicals, there's it's an OC spray. It dissipates with fresh air, and there's research it's available to support the non-toxicity of it after application. So again, that's something that certainly can be checked through the manufacturer and that we've done research on. So I hope that answered your question. I do see that.
Just quickly, quick follow-up, Chief. So that needs to go to the public. So many people have absorbed those chemicals. We as a city have to get, if it can be, I'm still tasting it in my face mask. I mean, I don't know what that stuff is, and no one else does. And so if that could be made public immediately, it is most necessary.
Okay, I'll check with the manufacturer to see if that's something that they can release the content. Most of what's in that is actually a propellant that helps project it, not the actual chemical itself. It's only a 5% actual chemical. The rest is just a propellant like in any hairspray or anything else. With that said, I also see, I want to recognize, I was told the order was Aletha, and then Aaron, and then Vlad, commissioners, Commissioner Wall.
And then Matthew.
And Matthew.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for convening this forum because I've been following our progress, and I'm really interested in, first of all, asking about the 6 recommendations that were not implemented because there were some things that were outside of your purview. The mayor mentioned that you would review those. However, unless I was not paying close enough attention, I don't believe I heard you tell us what those 6 were. I heard you say what you had done, Chief. However, I did not hear those 6 items that were not omitted or were not implemented, excuse me. And the reason why I say that is because if they're outside of your purview, we as the community have to identify whose purview they're in. And if it has to be something that is an amendment to the city charter needs to be changed, some state level political action needs to be taken, then we have to have a clear plan of action to move toward the implementation of those recommendations. And I won't lecture, but we know all the way back to the Homestead Act that gave large plots of land to people of European descent, and they would live there for a period of time and then have that into perpetuity, all the way through to redlining. Dr. Richard Rothstein listed well in his book, The Color of Law, the GI bills that prevented African-American males and the like from getting access to money that would have then created generational wealth for their families. We know that the law has long been used to marginalize communities of color. And so building another safety commission or civilian review board, while I believe that has merit, we have to get to what legal barriers are in place that we can begin to move against that will allow us to achieve the goals that will allow for what I believe is called, and I'm not a lawyer, equal protection under the law, because right now we're not seeing that. So if you would please recount those or recap those things, those 6 items that you did not, you're not able to implement. Please and thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Again, I see many hands up, so I'm going to try to be a little bit more brief so I allow more time for questions and out of respect for you. So we have every recommendation listed and color codes to where we're at on them and who's, what the progress is. There are certain things, like the mayor working with the APATA Commission to change this, how we deal with large municipalities versus small rural police departments. There's issues with felony murder legislation. Those are all things at the state and federal level. There are certain things that I have no ability to have any impact on at all. So those would be something that, as the mayor said, outside my purview. And I think Commissioner Sink was next.
Real quick before you move on, I heard two. I heard you say OPATA working more, or the mayor working more closely with OPATA, the felony murder statute, which I believe Commissioner McChrystal put forth, but there should be 4 more.
I don't have. With 80 recommendation, I have to go through and try to pick out each one. I'm not sure
Okay.
the exact 6
If you
that.
send those to us, if you not to step on your sentence, Chief, please forgive me, but if you would be so kind as to send us those 6 via email or have the mayor's office do it, I would be extremely grateful. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Aaron. Commissioner, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So I'm glad to hear that we are going to be looking at the policies around deployment of chemical agents. I want to focus for a little bit on the wooden projectiles. I saw from videos and personal accounts many reports that those were fired directly at protesters, and got me reviewing our use of force policies that clearly state that they should be skip fired off the ground. And so this strikes me, we're having 1 or 2 problems, either the policy's not being followed well, or there's some really clear misalignment with the community and the police expectations on what that policy means on the ground. And so you could talk a little bit about that in your plans to review that in your use of policy review.
Absolutely. We usually are very careful about whose hands we put the mobile baton round deployment mechanisms in, and they are skip fired, and they are trained to skip fired, and they are by policy in order to be skip fired. They're not allowed to direct fire them. And because of that, if you have any evidence, everything that I've reviewed to date, and there's thousands of videos out there between everybody's cell phones, I don't have everything. But if what I've reviewed has been skip fired, if you have video evidence of it, please forward it to either the director's office for their outside review or to internal affairs, and we will act on anything where there was a direct fire of that particular device.
If I could just add to that, there are videos of direct fire. There's one video that has been shared.
Please provide them.
Yes, people on this call have it, of what happened Sunday night, on Pentecost Sunday night, just a week ago. So I have them, and I will get them to you.
Thank you.
And
okay,
also,
next we had.
I'm sorry, real quick. And I would request that I am hearing thousands of complaints and videos of what happened over last weekend and these last 7 days. I would request that those be reviewed outside of your office, that we all should review them, because there's way too many. I've been getting them night and day. I can't even keep up. And so that needs to be a whole separate process of a review, what had happened these last 7 days.
Commissioner, this is Andy. That's why we set up a separate process outside the chain of command, because I know a lot of folks may issue complaints and go through internal affairs, but we also wanted to make sure folks that could send reports directly to the director's office. So those videos, pictures, complaints can be sent to reportcpd@columbus.gov, reportcpd@columbus.gov. So they'll be reviewed by our EEO officer in the director's office, Assistant Director Kathleen Ward, Deputy Safety Director Craig Stone, and a faith leader. I think that leader's been identified. Is that correct, Robin, Aaron, or Eric Brown? Is that right? Eric Brown, who's a pastor on the East Side and been involved in a lot of justice reform efforts. And then those recommendations and complaints and issues where clearly things were outside of policy and didn't meet our expectations will come to the chief, the safety director, and myself. So there's a process outside of the chain of command for those people that have a lack of confidence or concerns about going through IA.
Thank you, Mayor. And I see Commissioner Kogan has been patiently waiting.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief Quinlan. I wanted to ask for an update, I guess, on two of the recommendations. Mayor Ginther, earlier you were talking about independent investigations. And if I understood correctly, it sounds like BCI is going to be involved in some capacity. I understand that may be the best we can do kind of in the short term. But I think in the longer term, I do hope we think a little bit more about this. I know this is an issue that we investigated, and there are, I think, advantages, but there's also some drawbacks with BCI in terms of political independence, in terms of delay in getting to scenes to collect evidence, and in terms of transparency. I know Wisconsin has tried that kind of model, and it has not worked out that well. So I do hope we over the long term, when we're thinking about setting up a system of independent investigations, that's not kind of necessarily the only option we're looking at. And the second recommendation, I think, was one of the recommendations that came out of all the subcommittees, and is probably one of the most important ones that I haven't heard you discuss, is changing the timing for the probationary period. I understand that's a complicated recommendation that requires a charter amendment, but I would like to know kind of where we are on that process as well.
Commissioner, I'll answer your first question and then maybe ask the chief to address the second question. I hear you, and I absolutely agree with you. The independent investigation and working with BCI would be a first step. It would not be a final solution. And we're committed. I view all of this work as a commitment to continuous improvement and justice. There are going to be some initial steps that make things better, but we're not going to address, racism and discrimination and get the justice and reform we want without being committed to continuously improve upon and hold ourselves accountable for it. So I appreciate your point. I understand where you're coming from, and I agree with it. The BCI, I think, approach would be a first step, not a final solution. And then your second question, Commissioner, I'll let the chief respond to on the probation issue.
Thank you very much, Mayor. So the recommendation on probation is a very high priority for me. I'm being told by the Civil Service Commission that it's just simply implementing it as a language change that we can do now without a charter change. But I'm also getting other information from other portions of the government that feel more confident if it were actually go through more of a legislative or a charter formal process. So it brings up some challenges of whether how we can move that. And it's a high priority for me. I want it done. I want it done as fast as possible, because a lot of the training that you've recommended that we implement extends the amount of recruit training time, which decreases the available probationary time. And so I think this needs to be a very high priority, and I'm ready to implement it the day I'm told we're good to go.
Chief,
I'll follow up and just say this, Commissioner. We will have a specific plan of action back to you all by the end of the month. Us not knowing how to do it or, having questions about this or that is not acceptable. And we will have a report and a plan of action to you and the commission by the end of the month.
Mayor, and thank you for raising that, and glad. Our subcommittee worked very closely with the city, and Vlad helped me with the city because I can't remember, that has done this work. And we had a really long, in-depth conversation. And that, Vlad, I remember, if I remember correctly,
it was Denver.
a report and those contacts. So it's in our work from our subcommittee hot topics. And I think that they were very willing to work with us. There are other cities that have done this. We understand that it will be difficult. They made it very clear to us. And so I don't think we have to reinvent anything. We've spoken to people that are willing to help us go on this journey, and that is in our report.
The next two that I see was Commissioner LaShawn Carter and then Dr. Jones.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity. So I had a couple questions, but I'll for the lack of time, I'll probably just stick to really just two. One is, at what point, and I see the annual report that you guys produce and publish every year. At what point will it be declared inside of your annual report the insidious nature of racism throughout the ranks in the intentional effort to root it out, root and stem? I think at some point it has to be acknowledged that racism exists, and it exists in a very real way within the ranks, in that there's going to be an intentional effort to root that out. And one of the things, the reason why I asked that is because one of the recommendations that I don't know whether or not you have been able to accomplish or is on your short list is one of the recommendations was the development of an officer at the sergeant level that is directly responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So an officer of DEI, that was one of the recommendations that was developed. And I wonder if you have identified an officer whose only responsibility with no patrol duties to focus internally on DEI efforts. That person will need to be trained and coached, but that person needs to be seen as a fellow officer with credibility and respect among his peer officers. So that's one. And when I say his, I'm sorry, I also mean her, because I think that it's important that we acknowledge that our female officers are also credible in that space. The other question that I have, and this one is more specific to what has been happening the last week, is has there been any real conversation around the use of tear gas? The reason why I ask about that is because in all forms of war, the tear gas has been banned. And I do recognize, even within the statutes of the Geneva Convention, it does allow for domestic use in the cases of riot. However, as it relates to the humanitarian needs of our people and the impact on what it psychologically does when tear gas is used, has there been any real discussion around the use of tear gas as a control measure and its impact on the psychology of people when they're put in those situations where they're, scattering and running, and now it's become a uncontrolled environment as it relates to responding to things that are quite unnatural, even in times of war?
Thank you. So I'll deal with the second question first. The military actually uses tear gas and trains with tear gas frequently. They ban mustard gas and other poisonous gases, of course. So that's the nuance regarding that. Without the use of tear gas in a large crowd where police officers are being attacked and properties being destroyed and businesses looted, without the option of using a device that allows us to have no personal hands on someone, what other option have you left us? It is worse to have officers go into a crowd and go hands-on. Plus, when you go hands-on, then you're seizing somebody, and now you're obligated to arrest them and prosecute them, where the use of mace, it allows them to scatter and not face criminal charges, not have to have an even uglier interaction where there's a tug of war between an officer and another person of our community. And so I think if we don't have that as an option when it's appropriate and when it's done under direct supervision, that we really have no other options left to us to protect our community or officers.
I'm sorry, before you go to the second part of the question, the one thing that's troubling for me in regard to that is there have been videos of Columbus officers pouring out water that people were using to rinse and wash their faces when they have been pepper sprayed and maced. And so, what is the protective measure of officers doing that?
Okay, very good question. So one, some of those were actually being used as weapons launched against police officers. Others that were being used as decontamination were also becoming a problem because you use the tear gas to get people to leave the area. That's the goal, not to seize them and arrest them, but to get them to leave. And when they decontaminate, they can return right back to the street and then continue to engage officers and damage property and loot businesses. Then we're working against our own efforts. So that was part of, sometimes a screwdriver is a screwdriver, but if you use it to break a car window out and start the ignition, it's a criminal tool. Sometimes a water bottle is a water bottle, but if you use it to decontaminate to get back into the chaos, then sometimes that works against our efforts. And those are tactics that we need to consider on a case-by-case basis. So back to your first question, which was on the diversity inclusion officer. Thank you. The sergeant, we're still looking at that. We're trying to find where there's going to be enough work for a 2,080 hour a year person when we have other diversity inclusion officers who are liaisons to specific diverse communities, New Americans and Latino community and African American community and others. LGBTQ.
I don't mean to be flippant, but I can tell you to look out your window and I can tell you there's 2,000 hours worth of work.
Commissioner in Chief, let me just end it here. We are committed to it. We'll get it done. And we'll report back on who that person is going to be and what their work plan is for the year. Clearly, based on everything we're seeing and everything we're hearing and everything that we know is true, I'm not sure that one person can do all the work that needs to be done. We may very well need a much larger devoted resources and staff to get the work done that has been described and recommended by the Commission. So Commissioner Carter, we will get it done and it will be done swiftly.
Mayor Ginther, respectfully, I cannot, I know we must move on, but I have to say this. So Chief, you said that in regard to the chemicals being released on Saturday, no one was looting. No one was stealing. People, yes, were being verbal and full of passion and rage and anger, but they were peacefully protesting and y'all fired the first shot of tear gas on a group of people. I don't mean y'all. The officers fired the first shot that made this whole thing escalate. And so I can't let that stand. Yes, people are full of rage. And I understand people believe it's because of George Floyd, but it's because of the experience of everyday citizens that people were enraged. That just rose it up, George Floyd. And so people were angry, yes. And they were verbally abusive, yes. But your officers quickly escalated. And no one was looting. No one was stealing. No one was doing anything that would require that level of force in the middle of the day in downtown Columbus. Period.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. And again, those are opportunities for us to, as City Attorney Klein said, that there'll be an independent review of all that after the fact. And I'm changing policies every day in coordination with discussion with the mayor. And I please, Commissioner Carter, don't get me wrong. I did not intend to say that I was not open to implementing that full-time diversity inclusion person. What I was trying to say is we're in the process. It's one that I agree with. We're building out where we're going to put that person with 2,080 hours of work a year. So we're trying to develop the job description and what we want them to do. I have every intention of pursuing that, as the mayor said. So Dr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you all for this opportunity. I wanted to chime in because Tammy made a really good point when she talked about use of force and how the situation was escalated with the deployment of the tear gas and whatnot. And I think there needs to be a top-down philosophical approach when we think about use of force. Best practices in many law enforcement agencies are embracing the response to resistance instead of using use of force, because that changes the whole narrative and the framework. And I think there may be an opportunity for Columbus Division of Police to adopt a response to resistance policy and do away with and let that policy supersede what we call use of force. And then that will then influence what those responses are in using force, but using it as a response to resistance. The other thing is, in terms of questions, I have a couple of them. When you first started, you mentioned that there was some pre-service training that you have recently implemented as it pertains to crowd control and whatnot. And I'm curious as to whether or not there is in-service training for the officers that are already in the department. And if so, how many officers have actually had that in-service training for addressing and dealing with crowd control? So that's one question. The other one is, and this may be for the mayor, we were talking about developing a work group for creating a civilian review board, and that was going to be established, I believe, by next month. I would like to know who has been, or are you all considering for that? Have you leveraged the universities in the area to provide some guidance and assistance on best practices, even in terms of developing a working group model? And then the last question that I have, because we seem to have missed it because you talked about a lot of things being outside the purview of what you can address. One of the things that we definitely need to address, whether or not it's outside, internal, whatever, is the FOP contract. And making sure that there are some substantive changes, not just to the barriers to creating a civilian review board, but also the responses and the reprimands and how long they stay in a personnel file for an officer. I think those are some definite things that need to be discussed, they need to be addressed, and they need to be revised moving forward. If we're going to talk about transparency and changing the culture, those are some of the things to do it. And then lastly, I forgot, there was one more thing. In terms of recruitment and hiring and diversifying the ranks and all that stuff, well, it's good if you have more diversity in your recruitment classes, but I'm more so concerned about the efforts internally currently that are creating a culture to accept and embrace officers of different races, background, creeds, and colors, because right now that alone is a barrier. You can recruit as many people as you want, but if they don't feel comfortable and feel like they have a sense of belonging within the department, that's a problem. And so I'm curious to know what are the efforts surrounding that as well. So those are my 4 questions that I have.
Thank you, Doctor. So the training on everyone regarding use of force, we've always referred to as an action response to resistance. And that's how our policy is established on a continuum. And we train everyone on the policy, especially when I change it. Everyone is trained on it and signs off that they've been trained for annual training. The one area we do need to improve upon there is getting all 2,000 members of the Division of Police through scenario-based training on crowd control. Right now, we train our recruit and we bring a lot of our division personnel out to help provide that training, but it's not all 1,900. And in this instant case, we're using everyone in the division from all parts of the division to engage that. And then the last question was the
hiring and diversity with acceptance of the.
Right. So one of the things is, again, I brought the Anti-Defamation League in to provide that training, and we are working on building platforms to ensure through some of these internal officer community surveys that you've recommended that we can try to find out where what the actual level is of officers' comfort level in the Division of Police and where we can build on that model.
Dr. Jones, Commissioner Jones, Andy here. I think it's a great idea to reach out institutions, a higher ed and universities around this civilian review group. We have not done that yet. I think it's a great idea. And there's probably some pretty incredible resources we can leverage to make sure that process is effective and gets done what we need to get done. I guess a question I have for the chief, how many of our officers then have been through our crowd control training? Of our 1,900 officers, how many of them have been through crowd control training?
Thank you, sir. 100% have been through it and been through it many times. The area that I'm mentioning is that it's been several years since, because of all the new training that has been required under state continuing professional training and other training that is expected. We have not done recent in the last 4 or 5 years update training on scenario training on crowd control tactics. So that's everyone's been trained multiple times, but this is an area we have to improve on.
Well, clearly that has to be a top priority, particularly as we change these policies to better meet, not based on minimum legal standards, but meeting and exceeding the community's expectations. That has to be a top priority for us to get all of our officers trained and have clear expectations for them moving forward. So appreciate you raising the question, Commissioner Jones.
Thank you. And I also see Commissioner McChrystal has been patiently waiting, and then Emily Buster, Commissioner Buster.
Well, thank you very much, Chief, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. Just a few quick things. One, regarding Tammy's comment of the tear gas and chemical gas, there are safety data sheets available, and I would recommend that, since the role of government is safety of the people, understanding your comment, Chief, about decontamination and returning, but understanding people have health complications, I think this city posting or publishing the safety data sheets, including how to decontaminate, would be helpful and healthy for the folks that are out there. The other one's kind of been addressed, but I just wanted to make sure it was brought up. OPATA. So Governor Mike DeWine has spoken that he wants to support change. Recommendation 31 was making those changes in OPATA, which, Chief, I know are outside of your hands. Mayor, I know that you said that you're working on that, so I think now is the time to capitalize on that. The only one really here that I want, or I'm hoping to get some input on from everybody, public updates. So this is helpful, obviously, to have something that people can see. The commission meeting, we had recommended in recommendation number 2 that in the annual report, there would be something published with the status and updates. I think that should actually be something that's online. So if we already have the report online, people can see the recommendations. Obviously, they've been shared. News stories have covered them. Having a simple tracker that's available online that gets updated whenever any recommendation is updated, whether it's complete or in progress, having that status for the public to see would provide a lot of transparency and would be an easy way to implement something. So that's the only one I'm hoping to get comments on. I will say real quick, just to Zach Klein's office. So a lot of the comments regarding use of force and tear gas, the words haven't been used, but retribution, punishment, street justice. The videos we're seeing are not just general use of force against crowds, but individual officers who look like it's retribution against an individual who didn't listen to them. We're seeing people who are walking away, who are being sprayed in the back of their heads, who are being shot in the back of their legs when they're already walking away. So I would request that your office specifically look at those cases as well as the overall use of force. So that's all I have, and I'm just, like I said, hoping to get some input on the public updates.
That is part of our plan, sir, and I appreciate you asking about that. We do have plans to provide our tracking and update on a regular basis. So hopefully that'll meet your expectations. Commissioner Buster, Emily.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Just a couple things. One's not really a question, more just something I want to uplift as somebody who served on the hiring recruiting subcommittee. Just some concerns about what's happened the past 7 days, the experiences of communities of color, the efforts that those recruiting officers are going to have to make now to address the issues of diversity. I'm just concerned we've set ourselves back a bit. And those are good officers. We met them. Those that are working in recruiting, they're passionate about increasing diversity. But when you have these poor relations between the community, when a young Black kid sees his county commissioner, his council member, his congresswoman, have those types of interactions with police, I just think that could that really sets us back in those diversity efforts. So just something I want to uplift the work of those officers. They really got their work cut out for them now. Secondly, a question. I think a lot of us in the community wonder why such a different response when we have armed white protesters at our state house protesting Dr. Acton, and they're met with such a different response from police than what we saw the past 7 days when we have predominantly communities of color out there peacefully protesting, not armed, yet they're met with police in riot gear. Again, when we're talking about, Commissioner Alsada brought up trust, legitimacy, transparency, that stark difference in response from police certainly doesn't help those efforts. So just wondering why such a different response.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. So, opportunity to clarify: when you have people protesting with open carry and doing and not creating, not aggressively attacking police officers or damaging, vandalizing property. You saw them at the State House during this last week, actually break into the State House and cause damage, where we're not concerned about a person's speech. We're concerned about their actions. And when people are protesting in some of these other situations at the State House, for instance, there is a different response because it's directly driven by their actions. In this case, great people out there protesting. I've talked to many of them, had some fantastic conversations, and my heart goes out to many of them once I hear they can identify with a personal story. But what we have is other people that aren't as restrained and are injuring 166 police officers, have created millions of dollars in damage to city property, to mostly private property, and looting businesses. That's where police have a legal duty to step in and try to bring a stop to that. And
let me respond real quick to that. And I hear you, Chief. I do. But I want you to pause, and I want everybody here to pause, because we're talking about objects and things right now. And we always lose sight of the damage long term to people's souls and their spirit. And so if we could ever calculate the damage to our souls and our spirit, it would far outweigh those broken windows. We got broken souls in our city. And I don't know how you measure that, doctors and professors and people listening.
Thank you. That's my concern. When we're placing, concerns of property over people, I think we've lost sight of our true priorities and what's really important, and what we're here to do. And I know I follow one of our state senators on Facebook, and she posted on her Facebook page yesterday the stark differences within the State House compared to police presence currently compared to, when we had the armed protesters, complaining about wearing masks. So I think all that does is just continue to contribute to the trauma. And, I don't know if, some of the trainings, from Anti-Defamation League or some of those others are bringing up areas of racial trauma, community trauma, but I hope that they are, because it's something that we have to continue to press forward on. And we've got people hurting, and then, they're seeing these stark differences, and we're saying we want to increase diversity, and all of this has a ripple effect. So just, it's important to uplift that and recognize it and know the impact.
Commissioner, I totally agree. And you're not the first person, and my guess is you won't be the last, that have raised directly with me how different protests are handled differently based on who is protesting. And so I hear that and accept that challenge. Part of it is changing our policies, our training, but it's also about oversight and accountability. And we can't make the change, reforms, and seek and get justice for people in our community unless we are going to make ourselves accountable to them and have the oversight of law enforcement that we need. Division of Police is very much about the chain of command and respects the chain of command a great deal. What's important for us to remind the Division of Police is that chain of command goes from this chief to the safety director, and from the safety director to the mayor, and I answer to the people of Columbus. And if we don't continue to seek justice, change, and reform, to have the community seeing the change and reform that they need to see, the only power law enforcement has is what's given to them, which is what is granted to them by the community. If that sacred bond and trust is demeaned, undermined, or broken, this entire community safety and that of our officers is all at risk. And so I appreciate you raising it and speaking to it, and us making a renewed commitment to understand that. The chain of command ultimately leads to the people of this city, and we can never forget that. Before we move on, I did want to mention the 6 recommendations that we couldn't put our finger on earlier that I think Commissioner Waugh raised. I don't know if I want to read all these to take up time, but they had to do with crisis response teams, referral incentive to include underrepresented minorities, city should incentivize an annual officer wellness assessment, post-incident drug and alcohol testing, collaboration with OPADA, training requirements to the size and function of the law enforcement agency. Number 6, mayors encouraged to work with city officials, prosecutors, and eliminate the use of felony murder statute. Of those things, I believe that 4 are collective bargaining issues, and the 5th and 6th are legislative concerns. What I will do is charge the mayor's office with giving an update to the commission on what our strategies and approach is going to be with timelines associated with those 6 that the chief does not have the ability to go ahead and implement. So we will get you an update with our strategy and timetables on that. Commissioner Waugh, I didn't want to leave this session without coming back to the question you raised earlier.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. But I did want to touch on something Emily said. I know we're over time, but to the people, it appears as though when armed people of European descent are at the State House and they're met with little resistance. However, when protesters are met with police and riot gear, that there is that gives the impression that we're not as valued. And that's as politically correct as I can put it. But at the end of the day,
Letha, let me help you with that. It gives the impression.
No. Wait. Don't, please, excuse me. You know I have tremendous respect for you. But it appears as though, because if you were to send police in riot gear to meet a group of armed protesters, I don't think that they would abdicate their willingness to use force against that in the same way that unarmed protesters do. And that sends a dangerous message. And I had to share that.
I'm sorry, Letha, for interrupting you, but I have to get this out. It gives the impression that our bodies are a threat. That's the impression. Because every time we show up, our bodies are a threat. Joyce Beatty and Shannon Hart and Kevin Boyce's bodies were threats.
47, as opposed to an AK-47 or an MAO2 or an M16.
I accept that. And that challenge and that charge to seek justice, change, and reform. And I hear you. I wish I could say that I understand that or I've had that experience, but that would be a lie. I'm a white, straight man that has never been through what you have been through, but it is my responsibility to own the remedy and the change. And I appreciate your willingness to speak so passionately to the work that lies before us.
Thank you. I was asked to recognize Commissioner Burns before we wrap up as time has expired. So Commissioner Burns.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions, one about a general recommendation that the commission made to expand the pool of subject matter experts for training modules during the training academy. I wanted to know if that had been done across the board, or at least an investigation of which courses that could be done in. And then second, and related to that, Chief Quinlan, you mentioned a new youth policy and youth police interaction policy. I wanted to know a bit of the status of that. What sorts of changes have been implemented already, or at least are being included? What group has the police department kind of partnered with to bring in a subject matter expert on youth and police interaction? And then finally, on that new policy, does it include developmentally appropriate de-escalation tactics for working with youth and teens?
Outstanding questions. Thank you so much. So we are actively, again, getting this at the 1st of February and then getting into COVID. I've already given direction to my staff to look at every lesson plan and find where we can bring in community partners and psychologists and other experts that can help develop a lesson plan that specifically talks about de-escalation with youth and engagement with youth. Our youth services that I developed is currently staffed with 1 sergeant and 5 officers. We have I've authorized the strength to 10 officers right now with the staff we have available. We're starting off with one sergeant, 5 officers to try to provide and develop that program out. Commander Rhonda Grizel has presented me with a plan that called Yes, Youth Engaged for Success. And we are working on trying to develop that program out. Again, with the COVID crisis stuff, there's limited actions to be implemented as most people were required to stay at home. But now that people are getting back into the community, we're developing these programs out. We're looking for civilian partners, and those courses are being developed as we speak. And there's one at the very bottom that I did not get to. I've talked Mr. Callaway. Okay. So I've been able to answer the question for the commissioners. Again, I was asked to go to 11:30. I'll stay as long as anybody wants, but in respect to commissioners' time, I do hope that regardless whether no one can say we've arrived, no one can say that the work is done. I hope the takeaway is that we took every recommendation seriously. We've made tremendous progress. And most importantly, we've made it a priority. I made it the very top priority, regardless of everything going on in our community. I still had the retreat and still gave direction of what we were going to implement and made it priority 1, day 1, to focus on every recommendation. And we've made tremendous progress. I'm very proud of what we have accomplished and very committed to finishing the job. With that, I will, out of respect
Thank
for the
you.
time, I'll end it.
Thank you, Chief. And I just want to thank everyone for their time this morning, their questions, their engagement. Thank you again for all of the incredible work that has been put into the recommendations. And I want to thank Chair Jackson for her continued commitment, engagement, and leadership. As you know, this was an update, and we have to be committed to continuous improvement and justice. And we will continue to come back to the commission and report out progress. And as I stated earlier, the things that we are doing right now, in addition to the recommendations and informed by the recommendations of this group around the Civilian Review Board, a third-party investigation into fatal use of force and other use of force complaints. We're working on with the state, as was mentioned by the commissioner earlier, and specifically reevaluating the use of force continuum. Very informative input from both Commissioner Alsada and Commissioner Jones today about how we go about that and potentially changing the way we even talk about it, and clearly need to do more training based on the community's expectations around that work. So look forward to coming back to you with a couple specific things, and in response to Commissioner Law's point around the 6 things that is not within the chief's purview, the mayor's office will follow up with the commission with specific strategies and approaches and timetables associated with those 6 recommendations as well. Chair Jackson, do you have any closing comments before we wrap up here today? And
very, very quickly, I want to thank you, Mayor and the Chief, but I especially want to thank the members of the commission. We've not been in touch, for several months, and yet you certainly showed up today. I still hear your passion. Maybe it is even increased in light of the most recent activities across our country and in our city. So I look forward to continuing to work with you. And we are ready to receive those updates as quickly as we can get them, Mayor. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair Jackson. I know Council President has been on and engaged. He wasn't necessarily on the agenda, but he is our legislative leader and wanted to at least give him a chance to offer a word before we wrap up here today. President Harden.
Thank you, Mayor, and I just want to join everybody in the appreciation that we have for this commission. We heard a lot about accountability for police, but the truth is there has to be accountability for the mayor, myself, and the police chief to move forward on the things that you have the hard work that you've done and the real police reform suggestions that you put before us. So I am grateful that this community has a blueprint in front of us because of your hard work. And on behalf of my council, we look forward to rolling up our sleeves and being that accountability arm, but also expecting you to hold us accountable as city council members and your leaders to move this agenda forward. So thank you and look forward to the journey ahead.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time, your commitment, and passion for the justice and reform, and make sure that everyone in this community feels served and protected and not just policed. God bless. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, Mayor.